Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. If I could have your attention, please. Thank you very much for returning after a long day of interesting conversations. Thank you for your commitment to stick around for this final session. In many respects, this final session will be the most interesting because it's going to be quite concise. We have an hour allocated. We've started a bit early. If we finish earlier than the hour, that's okay too. You heard from Marty Adasari this morning that the purpose of the Worldwide Security Conference is to define an action agenda, not just for the EastWest Institute, but principally for the EastWest Institute and its partners. It's really to lay out options for the different actors represented here to advance the common interests of the communities, states and other interests that are brought into play by the questions that we've put on the table today. On the assumption that everyone was present for the plenaries this morning before lunch, this session will report back on the concurrent sessions. The chairs of each of those concurrent sessions will report back for about 5 minutes, and then we'll receive some commentary on those reports back from our two guests, Kanwal Sibal, who's not with me at the moment, and Maciej Popovsky, who will then reflect on what the reports of these sessions were. This is meant to be an interactive session, so people from the floor should feel free to intervene if they feel strongly about something at a certain point. Just raise your hand, and if the situation allows it, I'll acknowledge you. But after we complete these reports, which really should only take around about 20 minutes, we'll be going to the floor to hear your reactions, to get from you some input of things that you think might not have been covered. After all, the reports from the individual chairs will only be 5 minutes long, so there's a lot of territory that they won't be able to cover. We have note takers for this session, so we are really looking to come up with a list of interesting ideas, some practicable, some crazy, but we really want to understand what the limit is here of what we might do. So without further ado, I'll ask Maria if you're prepared to go first to introduce your session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Our session was called Afghanistan and its Neighbors, Regional Imperatives with Economic Security. Here are some of the key ideas and challenges that came out of that session. First of all, the objective is historical re-knitting together of the region, particularly for infrastructure, trade, and transit. And this includes Central Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and China. All of these were evoked during our discussion. The countries need particularly, an emphasis was laid on the two big challenges for Afghanistan and Pakistan, which would be energy and electricity, but not limited to that. Again and again, we emphasized that regional cooperation is a key component of the Afghan strategy itself post the 2014 elections and the transition, as you know, to their own security provision. And this for political and human security as well as for economic. But, and here's the big buts, there will be no regional cooperation and no partnership without good political transitions. And this is particularly true of Afghanistan. It will continue, Afghanistan, to need international assistance well into the decade after 2014. The importance and the stress on regional approach is also the proposal is that is the only way to prevent reoccurrences of terrorism, such problems as drug trafficking and issues like border security. And finally, here are some of the, at the very end I asked everyone, what would you actually need to happen right now? What are the issues that you would see to happen? What is absolutely essential? Political will is paramount in order to move from talking about it to actually implementing and getting the action done. For instance, on election laws, election structures have to be implemented immediately. There must be more transparency in order to encourage investment in mining and in banking law. Human rights issues, particularly for Afghanistan, do better in implementing them, such as, for instance, the law on violence against women. Justice is needed and is demanded by the people. And finally, just to look at some of the wish list, which we're not always entirely sure will happen, but which people put on the table. How to make sure of mutual accountability, not just for fair elections, but also addressing corruption and governance. How to make transparent and predictable a legal environment for international investors, without which there will be no economic viability. How to continue to ensure stability through raising of the basic standards of peoples, and how to turn the term of a landlocked country, such as is Afghanistan, by unlocking it and making it into a transit hub, a trade, transport, and transit hub. I think those were the key ideas that came out of our session.
Thank you. Very good list. We can look at a bit more detail later about how we might implement some of those and who the key actors are. Ikram, could I go to you now, please?
Our breakout session concerned water, energy, food security nexus, and actually enhancing the role of private sector investment in the Arabian Peninsula and the Horn of Africa. Basically, we concentrated on private sector involvement and how private sector involvement force multiplies the capital gains that can be made in any area, particularly where there is an area of neglect. Now, there are many issues that have to be resolved for the private sector. International policies have to be changed. And I'm going to ask later on one of the speakers to enhance on this. As Teddy Ashnafi said, that a new breed of leaders have to come forth and take the bull by the horn, so to say. And we listen to what are the challenges in the Horn of Africa, in countries like Somalia, Eritrea, and we had a very good intervention from Eritrea and the soft initiative that they are taking to ensure investment in their country. And we heard about places like Ethiopia, where a lot of initiatives have been taken to enhance the agriculture sector, to enhance the oil and gas sector. Now, Professor Kiang, one of the speakers, dwelt at length on China, and he emphasized that there are three challenges: the triple crisis, which he called the global economic depression, the climate change, and social equity. And he said, in order to meet these challenges, you've got to have collaboration, and collaboration, and talked about transparency. And I'm going to ask Professor Kiang to make a short intervention on this in his time. And obviously, we had a lot of discussion on the changes that have taken place in North Africa because of the Arab Spring, and how countries in Europe are viewing the development, and what is more apt for development, whether public sector involvement or private sector involvement. And the consensus was private sector involvement, yes, but there is public sector involvement, but that has to be responsible, and that has to be dynamic. And then again, we go back to the same issue of leaders, whether in the private sector or in the public sector. Unless you have leadership which is of the value that can create job opportunities, that can create market opportunities, you're going to have problems. Now, what we have is, as Professor Standard said, create standards, and where he basically talked about urban development, but I took it on a general scale to create a standard, and which he says measurable criteria, and low carbon emission economies, new renewable energies, recycle and reusing, and converting of waste to this thing. And of course, continuing the recycling of water, paper, glass, plastic. Now, when you have all this mix together and we understand the development, at the end of the day, the resources are short. You've got short water resources. You've got to work with the available resources that you have. You have to conserve those water resources. You've got to make sure that those water resources go into force multiplying the cash crops that you have. And you've got to make sure that cash crops have a market and also have the infrastructure to ensure that from the farm to the market, the roads exist to take it in a way that there's maximum loss on the way. It was a very good session, and really, like I said in the end, it was, you have to understand that if you have got to involve international donors, if you've got to invite private sector involvement, then you have to create a market, you've got to create a level playing field, or you've got to create an area where private sector is interested in involvement. And make no mistake, unless private sector gets involved, there will be no development. Thank you.
Thanks, Ikram. Well, Ikram suggested that he'd call on Teddy to make a small comment on how we're going to get these sort of new leaders that we've talked about. So do you want to do that now or in a few minutes when you've had a chance to think about it? But
yeah, I can comment on it. I mean, I think the theme is some of the people who were in our session have heard this already, but the challenges are quite complex, and we need a collaboration of business, government, and civil society to work together in solving these challenges. And in all these three stakeholders, constituencies, we need new leadership. With all due respect to the a lot of wisdom in the world, I think new leadership of innovation, of looking at these problems in a new light must take place. And one of our colleagues said there must be an enabling architecture, ecosystem to allow some of this leadership to come up and take a role in trying to solve some of these problems and issues.
well, thanks, Teddy. We can get back to the enabling architecture because it relates to what Maria said in her presentation about knitting together. But you're familiar with the Davos Young Leaders, World Economic Forum Young Leaders. There's all these other sorts of things around. Is that good enough? Is that throwing up the leaders we need? How would you characterise the deficit, and who can do what next, if anything?
Well, obviously, the World Economic Forum has its own types of, it's a different institution, and I think it's done a pretty good job in terms of putting together, these three elements. But, if we could solve this leadership problem, then, I think it's like finding the secret molecule or the secret potion of solving a lot of the world's problems. I think it's not easy. Institutions leading from places like Harvard Business School are trying to create leaders in other institutions. So I think, again, it's an enabling architecture must be forged by thinkers like the EastWest Institute and other think tanks to push this along.
Yeah, Sido, I don't know if you're here. Sido, are you here? Yeah, basically the conversation came up in the context of Somalia, which has just appointed 10 government ministers. And Sido from Somalia made the point that, well, 10 government ministers doesn't get you very far. And then when you think, well, they don't have too many bureaucrats working for them. So the sort of leadership that you're talking about, Teddy, is not leadership in general. It's finding somebody who can work in Somalia to create relationships between one or two of those ministers in a situation where the rules are not very well established, where the rules might be broken as you go along the way, if there are any rules anyway, who can work with the particular investment opportunities. Sido, what's your view on how do these leaders emerge, and do they have to be people who can break the rules because there aren't all that many rules, or how does this develop in this situation?
Yeah, normally what happened now, the ministries, they said that they need to collaborate with the private sectors, which is, for example, there is a Minister of Development, Social Development, which that one included education, health, and also, I think, sanitation, everything for that minister. So it has many things to do. But what they are doing is that they are delegating the educated people through the businessman to carry out that activity. So, yes.
Yeah, thanks, Sido. That's very useful. Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, I think when you're talking about, but Teddy was talking about the new breed of leaders, I think I saw a very good program run by EWI Director Joel Coven, Georgia Institute of Technology, where in every country's developing country, he went and picked out 20, 30 young people, and not students, just students. He took them up from the broad spectrum of society, right? And then he brought them, of course, with the basic academic qualifications. And then he had in-house training. And then what he did was he crossed them with other countries in the region, right? And what you had these people going back and actually really starting up small businesses and actually entering into government and creating that thing. I think that is the type of leadership Teddy is probably talking about, that the leaders actually are homegrown, but really have been given a force multiplication by the academic standards and the academic nuisances which are available in the West.
Thanks, Ikram. Well, we might leave that session there and move to the third session. Beate, would you like to give us your summary, please, your highlights?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. The breakout session number 3 focused on regional policy frameworks regarding water, food and energy in the Middle East and the MENA region. We had a great discussion with panelists from Jordan, Morocco, and Israel, as well as from London, government people and NGOs and think tanks alike. The focus was, I think, more on water than on food and energy. And I think when I look back at what we discussed this morning, when we spoke about or we heard about the global factors shaping economic security, I think we got an impression on what is actually already there in that region in terms of frameworks, in terms of awareness, in terms of solutions. That is much more than you would think of it normally. And this goes beyond the question of sharing water between Israel and Palestine, which is on many people's minds. It was, I think, one of the results we had was that in that region there is an awareness of the scarcity of water. There is a need for a better and just sharing of water, many levels. And there is a need to improve mechanisms, policy frameworks that exist at the governmental level or at other levels to move ahead on these issues. Then we looked at several frameworks in place, which exist, as I said, at governmental levels, based on bilateral or multilateral treaties, but also at NGO level. We saw the NGO Earth Middle East. We heard from Guidon Bromberg, who explained how this works with regard to Jordan and Palestine, an NGO that discusses and handles water management issues in these 3 countries, and not just in one country. So that's a good sign and a good start for improving mechanisms. We discussed then at some point the impact of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening, if you like, on managing water, food and energy. I mean, the response to this question depends very much on which part of the region you look at. So there is no general real conclusion, except maybe for one, that is that this democratization in that region has increased pressure on governments to take into account in their decision-making what the civil society is actually looking for, has increased transparency and the need not only to handle water issues in a, let's say, bureaucratic or political way, but look also at the users and at the need of the people. Otherwise, this could be a source for unrest, which is unwanted. So these are the main points. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Beate. Well, that's a rich agenda too, and I must say I'm a great fan of Friends of the Earth Middle East, and I think it's a great model for the rest of the world, quite frankly. So if Gideon is here and he wants to say something about it, he might. I'd like to ask Nick, maybe if you're willing, Nick, to just say a little bit about your perspective on these problems, because in a sense you're taking a longer term view and you're looking at really some of the instruments that have been traditional instruments. You've found them wanting. Would you like to just sort of reflect a bit on what you've heard before we go to our two commentators?
Just a couple of reflections. I mean, one of the things we found, looking at particularly North Africa, case studies of Tunisia and Egypt, is there's a big focus on essentially traditional development as the foundation of stability. But when we looked at scenarios going forward, we found it very difficult to find, except in the best case, in fact, for Egypt, where a kind of traditional development model, even with political reform, reduced risks of stability, instability to levels that would be considered manageable and normal. And so the idea of trying to focus more investment and activity more strongly on areas of instability like exposure to food shocks and energy shocks, water scarcity, energy scarcity, and some of the issues about which Gideon works on in terms of community management. So, and that actually requires quite profound changes in how you assess national investment policies, international donor policies, against a more sophisticated understanding of instability. Because to actually drive some of these investments, the first one is to prioritize the kind of investments, but actually delivering them on the ground takes different ways of incentivizing people, different regulation, often more, for example, it's much easier to build a windmill in North Africa than to drive energy efficiency investment. Energy efficiency investment is probably a better investment, certainly than a gas power station at this point in terms of resilience in the economy, but it's a much harder administrative task. So, essentially our feeling is without essentially a clear strategic view of what we're trying to achieve, it's very unlikely that type of reform will happen. And that's certainly the evidence of all developed countries where lots of these cost-effective investments were left on the shelf until climate change actually forced people to push for stronger reforms. But it's been quite a struggle actually to drive forward reforms of financial and administrative systems to capture some of these benefits. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think what I like about what you've said is the need for a strategic view of what we're trying to achieve. And I note from your summary, Maria, that you started with what is the strategic objective that we're trying to achieve. And the strategic objective you reported was not one that you devised or somebody outside the region devised. It's what we heard the Pakistan Deputy Foreign Minister articulate this morning. And it was a very good articulation, and the way you put it, knitting the region together, was great. I'd like to call now on Ambassador Sibal, who's a former Foreign Secretary of the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to give an overview of what he's heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. The subject is very complex, and putting it in perspective is not going to be easy in the few minutes that have been given to me. But let me make a few general observations. First, of course, that it's a very good initiative on the part of EastWest Institute to actually put this on the agenda and invite a deliberation and analysis of what the problems and opportunities that exist. On all these issues, of economic security in this wide region, there is a dire need now to take a collective look. And the situation, in some sense, is favorable because there's now increasing reluctance to get involved in conflicts to resolve differences because the cost of conflict has gone up a great deal, and all sensible governments want to focus on economic growth and welfare. So in that background, it should be easier to move forward in a more constructive way. However, if you look at this region of Southwest Asia and the Middle East, look at the number of actual conflicts on the ground. There is, of course, the conflict in Afghanistan. There is the Pakistan-Afghanistan problem. There is the India-Pakistan problem. There is Iran's nuclear issue, in which US, Israel, and the European Union are involved. There is Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict. There is the Shia-Sunni conflict looming. There is Turkey-Syria conflict in the offing. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has spilt over into Israel-Iran conflict because of the support, presumably, that Iran gives to Hezbollah and Hamas. So, while on the one hand, there is this movement towards trying to resolve issues without conflict, in actual fact, on the ground, you have a situation where there are so many conflicts which have divided solutions, and therefore the backdrop is not that conducive to early solutions. Number two, if you take energy, because energy, water, and food are the issues that have been identified in terms of promoting economic security. In case of energy, in this region, you have tremendous energy resources in the Gulf, in Iran, and in Central Asia, in particular in Turkmenistan. There are some very imaginative proposals to build pipelines, whether it was the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline, now the Turkmenistan-Afghanistan-Pakistan-India pipeline. But then this is hurtling against the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran with regard to the Iran-Pakistan-India pipeline. And insofar as the TAPI pipeline is concerned, we have first to stabilize Afghanistan and also create conducive conditions in Pakistan and resolve outstanding India-Pakistan issues before this can become a reality. Insofar as water issues are concerned, I think the one great success story, perhaps the only success story in the world, of two nations which have had a conflict spanning 6.5 decades, who have actually reached a very elaborate, viable, workable, and enduring water sharing treaty, and that is India and Pakistan on the Indus Waters Treaty. I don't think that any region in the world today can emulate such a treaty, because it is the first time that the rights of the upper riparian and the lower riparian have been clearly identified in a treaty. Unfortunately, the international law on this is uncertain, is vague, and therefore, elsewhere, the upper riparians feel the water belongs to them, and they disregard the rights of the lower riparians. And water is a very, very emotive issue. Now, the other problem is that while we can discuss water in general terms, but as economies develop and as there is more economic growth, there is need for more and more water, especially for industrial use in developing economies. And then there is the whole issue of water management, which is a very complex issue, which needs very hard decisions by government, which also needs a great deal of financial resources in terms of you have to develop new conservation techniques, conservation of groundwater. Now, the agriculturists in most of these countries do not have the requisite finances, so they are poor. Therefore, you have to have a lot of financing, especially if you go for drip water irrigation. While these issues need to be discussed, the solutions are not easy. Insofar as food security is concerned, I think the essential problem in enhancing food security can be achieved is through more extension services, conservation of groundwater, proper irrigation techniques, use of genetically modified crops, study of climate change issues and how they impact on food security. And of course, we must also think in terms of eventually reaching some agreement in the WTO on trade in agricultural products. Insofar as trade is concerned, which is an important component of economic security, so far as let's say Southwest Asia's interests in the larger Middle East is concerned, which will include the Gulf, I think countries like Pakistan and India have very vital interests in the Gulf in terms of huge manpower from our countries, huge trade. At least India has a huge trade with the Gulf countries. Our energy, 80% of our energy comes from the Gulf region. And at least in the case of India, we're getting $37 billion of remittances every year from this region. And in the case of Pakistan, if my figure is right, it's about 12 billion. The Afghans also are there in large number in the Gulf, working as expatriates and sending back money. There is this larger issue which was discussed in at least the Afghanistan group of transit facilities through Pakistan to Afghanistan and on to Central Asia, which can create energy corridors, trade corridors, which can actually lift this region economically very rapidly. Well, at least we feel, somebody said on our behalf, the US Assistant Secretary of State, that India is growing very rapidly and it's going to become a very large economy and therefore can become some sort of an economic anchor. So it's not me saying it, it's him, he's saying it, can become an economic anchor in this region. So in that context, in terms of economic security, a lot can be done if we can develop these kind of transit facilities through Afghanistan. India has committed itself to making large investments in Afghanistan. We are also exploring the Chabahar route through Iran to Afghanistan, but this will also then be problematic because of US sanctions. So let me conclude by saying that there is one thing that needs to be looked at, which is that in this region that you've described, there's so many organizations that are at work. And to what extent there is synergy between them, I don't know. There is, of course, the Arab League, there is the OIC, there is the ECO, there is the GCC, there is the SCO, there is the CSTO, all countries are establishing strategic partnerships with one another. There is the Heart of Asia, the Istanbul process that's also at work. In our case, we have a trilateral India-US-Afghan dialogue. There is a trilateral we are proposing a trilateral India-Afghanistan-Pakistan dialogue. There is trilateral Turkey-Pakistan, Afghanistan dialogue. Iran is also involved. Russia has also promoted another dialogue, quadrilateral dialogue between Tajikistan, Russia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. So there are a lot of diplomatic activity and people trying to deal with these issues, including economic security. So we wish them well. And I'll conclude very briefly by saying that a couple of points which were made with regard to Afghanistan, which I think are important. One is the early conclusion of the agreement between Afghanistan and the United States on the strategic agreement. They have given themselves a year to do so, but the feeling is that if this can be got out of the way, then this will create a certain degree of predictability and will help improve the situation in Afghanistan in the medium to longer term. Thank you.
Thanks, Kanwal. I think that was very useful. I take away from it, I think I interpreted it correctly to say that there seems to be a bit of an oversupply of diplomacy and an undersupply of results. But Before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to just foreshadow that after he makes his comments, we'll be going to the floor for some additional input from what might have been missed out, burning issues on the tip of your tongue. Khalid, I wonder if I might call on you as well to just sort of make some remarks from your perspective, where you sit, your long experience also in China as a sort of an actor in the region after we go to our next guest. If I could, my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Maciej Popovski, who's the Deputy Director General of the European External Action Service. He's one of Poland's senior diplomats, had long involvement in the accession process for Poland to the European Union, but has also served as a Director in DG Development. So that's a role that has particular relevance, I think, for this session. Maciej, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg, and very happy to be here. Well, let me start with the trivial question, meaning what are the reasons for our engagement seen from the EU with the Southwest Asia and the Middle East. It may seem obvious, but I think it's sometimes good to just recall them. First of all, there are political reasons, in particular now, and the wake of the Arab Spring. I mean, this is our neighborhood, and we need to take care of it. We need to engage, not only for our own security, but also for the general stability in the region. But also some, there are also good economic reasons to engage with Asia, with the Middle East. It's the question of not only having access to markets, but also to searching. Question of searching for external sources of growth, which, from the point of view of a crisis-ridden European Union, is quite relevant too. But on top of that, of course, comes the question of tackling the global issues together. This is something that many of the previous speakers have mentioned. Of course, that has been the subject of your debates during the day. Water shortages, energy shortages, food crisis, climate change. I don't think anybody can do it on its own. And of course, there we need an enhanced engagement with all the partners. I mean, and we have to foster and create new partnerships. In a way, being a bit self-critical, in Europe we spend a lot of time, particularly over the last 10 years, dealing with ourselves. Looking at our own institutional setup, the way we do business, writing a new treaty. And in the meantime, the world has changed. So once the new treaty was in place, we have a new setup there, we have a new service. We woke up and then we realized that the world is not what it used to be. And there was a lot of new partners out there with whom we need to engage in a different way. And that's exactly what we are now doing. It also has a regional dimension, something that I wanted to stress. We are very much attached to the notion of regional integration. Indeed, we have a lot of overlapping schemes. I mean, they were mentioned by the previous speakers, a lot of organizations engaging in the same kind of business. But indeed, we believe there is merit in doing things at the regional level. I mean, there is no one-size-fits-all recipe. I mean, I'm not saying that we can export the European integration model anywhere else in the world. I mean, if people want to profit from them, it's fine, and we're more than happy to share some of our experience. But as a matter of principle, we've been supporting the regional organizations in different ways. I mean, either by engaging with them politically. The most recent examples are the League of Arab States. And tomorrow, a ministerial meeting between the League of Arab States and the European Union is going to take place in Cairo. We also very much engage with the OIC, with the African Union, which is a strategic partner of the EU, and with the GCC. But also there are some new emerging regional setups that are worth supporting and engage with, and the Heart of Asia initiative was mentioned in that regard. If we go further east, we can look at Central Asia, of course, and Eastern Asia, which still, I think, in the process of looking at its own multilateral institutional and security setup, which we would very much support. But of course, we do not intend to impose anything, but we are ready to share our own experience. There is there are certain things that I think we have things to offer. Been thinking about it quite a lot in the course of the Arab Spring, trying to redefine the so-called neighborhood policy of the European Union. But the underlying principle was we should not impose things. So we can offer things if there is demand, but we should not impose. But there are certain issues that we could share. For example, the expertise of the EU and its member states, or at least some of them, in terms of transition management. I think there is a market out there. Things change. There are different models people can look at, and when it comes to urbanization or managing of natural resources or managing of energy markets or the security sector reform, I think that we can offer quite a lot if people are ready to take advantage. I mean, we've been engaging with different partners. I mean, I can give you one or two examples, even that are not that obvious. Example, China. China, the challenge of urbanization in China is huge. Every year, like 15 million people migrate into big cities, so it's the size of Holland, roughly. And it was the Chinese who came to us with the question, why can't we look at your experience with managing big urban agglomerations? And as a matter of fact, we created an EU-China Mayors Forum to look into issues like that. This is a less visible part of foreign policy engagement, but can be quite an effective one. Now, speaking of economic security, I think I would put it in the context of conflict prevention. And conflict prevention is at the very heart of the EU foreign policy as defined. And it goes back to the the European security strategy, a still valid foreign policy framework that was agreed in 2003, so almost 10 years ago. And one of the underlying principles of the EU security strategy is the preventive engagement. And that's exactly what we can do, also with regard to the critical resources you've been discussing today. Energy, where we think we should have more transparency and more sort of cooperative approach to the energy trade in particular, and that's something that it's at the center of the energy policy as we define it in the European Union. Food, again, also putting my former development policy hat on, we've been doing quite a lot to strengthen the supply side, but also to strengthen the resilience of developing countries to deal with food crisis. I mean, of course, there was a peak of activity back in 2008 during the food crisis, but it's not over. It's coming back time and again, and it's seasonal. So we really need to look into the structural challenges that are there, and of course, water. Water, I mean, has become a major foreign policy issue. The High Representative Cathy Ashton decided to put it on the agenda of the foreign ministers, and they already had a discussion on water issues, in particular with regard to Central Asia, but also to the Nile Basin, for example. And I think it's I was going to say it's coming our way. It's already there, and we should be ready to engage also in terms of strengthening the ability of different countries to manage the water resources in a collaborative way. In any case, the preventive engagement pays off, and as Paul Collier, the author of the famous book The Bottom Billion, he made a calculation that takes normally 7 years for a country to recover from a conflict and to arrive at the level of economic growth predating the conflict itself. So it's really worthwhile. And finally, on Afghanistan, as the previous speaker has left Afghanistan for the end, for us it's also a matter of a long-term engagement. Of course, we all have the 2014 on our mind, and there's several facets, of course. But we really need to think beyond, and we really need to think beyond 2014, and we need to think beyond the traditional concept of security. Because if Afghanistan is to become a viable state, it has to be strengthened in a multiple way. So we're also negotiating a new agreement with Afghanistan that started. The negotiation started several months ago. We'll continue our engagement on security matters, in particular with regard to the civilian police, because this is what's going to stay once the the foreign troops has left. We need reliable forces that would be able to provide Afghanistan with the security that is so badly needed. And of course, sources of economic growth, including in the regional context that was mentioned. So I'd like to conclude by thanking the EastWest Institute and all of you for all the good impulses that we can take home, because these are the issues that are at very heart of that are really our core business. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maciej. Well, I've been rather unkind, and I've indicated to Khalid that I'd like him to reflect on what he's heard. And I particularly value the presence of Khalid in this conference because he's the director of the UN Human Development Report. And at the end of the day, it's all about the people and less about the government. So, Khalid, would you like to give us your reflections?
You put me in a real pickle, you know. I wasn't certain what I was going to say. But these are very random thoughts. I hope people forgive me for this. And in being somewhat of an outsider to the security conversation, and of course I talked about human security, and which very much founded on human beings as being the center of all our efforts on security. But I thought I'll just highlight maybe 4 or 5 points. One is listening to various speakers, I'm struck by the gap between rhetoric and actual policy. Very large. A lot of expectations are there. A lot of hopes are there. But somehow the path to move towards a sane, balanced, sustainable world is less clear. And that's what was one takeaway. Huh? The second takeaway to me was actually a shared framework is essential. Neighbors do matter. And what is surprising for me is to learn that in some cases neighbors don't seem to matter so much. But they do matter because you can't change them fundamentally. And these are a result of conscious policy choices to strengthen ties. It can be done. History has given examples of that. And if you look at the negative part of the examples, I mean, I think the challenges between India and Pakistan have slowed down cooperation in South Asia dramatically for over a long period of time. And hopefully we're coming out of that long funk in a way. Huh? So I think if you think these countries matter and you think neighbors are important, you have to have some kind of shared framework. And how do we go about building that? Whatever region you call it, there was an interesting conversation at lunch with some colleagues. And I was struck by the fact that it's very difficult for people to think differently, partly because that's what we've been taught, that's what our experiences are. The third point I wanted to make is it is a rapidly changing world. I mean, it's moving much more rapidly. If you just take a step back, that we are seeing, I'll give you an example. The next Human Development Report is on the rise of the South. Not just China, India, Brazil, that's what people talk about. But there are at least 40 plus countries who are doing better on human development than predicted, if you were just to predict when they started. And that process has accelerated in the last decade. The rise of China is phenomenally important to developing countries. And another facet of that, talking about food prices, actually there are two sides of it. If you're a food producer, it's a fluctuation which hurts you. The rising prices may hurt some, but certainly benefit a lot of people as well, particularly farmers who produce those commodities, which others are buying. So there's, I think, a need to think carefully on how to think about the future in a way which matters. China is here to stay. Another 20, 30 years, these countries are going to be very large. There's an estimate of 1 billion middle-class consumers. Everything will change in our lifetimes, and it's changing. The fourth point I could make is which was striking for me was the civil society just needs to play a much larger role. If people can talk to each other, see each other more often, and this is what I was trying to hint at when the notion of soft borders. Really, hard borders may help at a certain point in time, but in our globally connected world, they're not very helpful. And therefore, all the training you get in staff colleges and all the thinking people give you when they talk about force capabilities has to move beyond that and to fundamentally to a point where people matter, and if you treat them as if they matter, actually conflicts and issues go, I mean, conflict matters go down as a issue concern. I'm struck by the lack of progress, for instance, on migrant rights. I mean, just Ambassador Sibal talked about the large amount of remittances for India, for Pakistan, for Bangladesh, for Afghanistan. But we treat, by the way, most of the migrants now, something like 60–70% migrants are actually to neighboring countries or in the same region. And we treat them rather badly. So we need to have strengthened those frameworks. And that actually produces a certain reservoir for worry. We did some work, and if you plot, when people are getting more educated, their demands for equal citizenship go up dramatically. They really believe they matter, and perhaps they do. If they do, governments have to listen to them. So therefore, social compacts, the basic citizen compact has to change. Ultimately, all this requires a rethink on how you look at security itself, the notion of security. If you think of borders, if you think of armed forces, you have to put people and their needs and economics first. The rest will follow. I don't know if I've responded to your request.
Excellent observations, Khalid, and they'll certainly help shape our thinking. Ladies and gentlemen, I promised the opportunity for interventions from the floor. We're running short of time, but I will invite 30-second to 1 minute interventions from the floor to register particular points. We'll need to be very quick, though, please.
This is with regard to the transport and trade theme, which has been prominent, especially in the Afghan discussion. The model that has reigned in these discussions all day has basically been a diplomatic one. And in the world of diplomacy, you want everyone happy, and everyone is going to just participate wonderfully in this seamless web of contact and trade. In reality, it's an economic model, and we have not acknowledged that many of the states involved are competitors. India, or Pakistan and Iran, or their ports, Chabahar versus Gwadar, they're frontal competitors. Afghanistan and Iran are directly competitors for routes to the east, etc. Everyone, Turkmenistan is with Uzbekistan, and there's an alternative to everyone. So those who choose not to play, they can opt out. The world will go on around them, but that reality has never really penetrated this discussion.
That's an excellent observation. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, further short observation?
Thank you very much. I also attended Afghanistan and its neighbors, but at the end of the meeting, if someone asked me about what happened, I said that it was that question about Afghanistan and its neighbor in Pakistan. I think we cannot eliminate or simplify the question by just excluding the other neighboring countries. If you're talking about water and water safety, water management, we cannot talk about the subject without taking into account Tajikistan, or if we are talking about drug trafficking and about transit roads, we cannot talk about that without discussing the issue of also Iran, or also about the terrorism, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and in neighboring Turkmenistan also are involved. So I thought that other issues or other neighboring countries also would have been taken into account.
Yes, I take Iran into very big account. So. Yes, thank you.
I think I'm absolutely surprised about this such a big issue, and without any participation from China. And I'm the one so-called token Chinese over here, and you heard about the impact and about the conflict or resolution or trade and all those issues. And I think without the presence of China, and I don't believe you can resolve anything. And I'm just saying that's realistic. That's 1.3 billion people over there, and I only find one here. And I'm even not I had only half of it.
You're a very good representative, CS. Thank you. To the end, I've got a few closing remarks to make, but before I do that, I'd like to invite Maria. Do you have a final 1 minute you'd like to offer? And then Beate and Ikram.
No, I think that you're quite right about China. If I had one comment to make about what we're looking at, is that the mixture, I come from the business world and I fully understand what you're saying. One thing is that you try to solve a lot of the problems we're discussing on a political and diplomatic. But where it comes up short is sometimes you get some process going diplomatically, and then you engender non-economically viable countries. And too often, I've seen too much stress put on solving security issues and solving political governance, as if you need all of that before you do the economic. And I just put in a plea from myself that the economic viability of countries be addressed concurrently with the other issues.
Thanks, Maria. Ikram?
I think I'd like to mention here that I don't think there's really a realistic appraisal of what is going to happen in 2014 in Afghanistan. I think a lot of us are living in self-denial about it. And the fact that, I think Khalid mentioned that so many hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent in Afghanistan, while Pakistan has been taking most of the sacrifices in everything. And there are about 4 times more people in Pakistan. And 3.5 billion Afghan refugees, 10% of Afghan population lives in Pakistan permanently. I think all these things need to be highlighted. You can't live in cuckoo land and just worry about this thing. Pakistan is central to the solution. If you've got a problem in Afghanistan, you cannot do it without addressing the issues of Pakistan.
Thanks. Thank you, Ikram. Beate?
Thank you. I would say we have, in our session, we have touched on economic issues of water management as well, but we haven't deepened them for a number of reasons. But I think that's an issue which could be explored further for the region, as well as the issue of transporter NGOs actually active in the field of resources management in the region, because I think these are a sign of hope and a sign of strength and an incentive for what can be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Beate. Kanwal will have one final word as well. Thank you.
No, this is just to complicate the issues a little more. So far as economic, very short. So far as economic security is concerned, and that's the theme. I think you have to look at the internal aspect and the external aspect. And the internal aspect, of course, you must have growth, you must have good governance, you must take the right decisions, and you must develop your domestic resources. Externally, of course, you have to have more trade with the rest of the world. You must be able to attract more FDI, and it's not that easy. You have to have access to energy and mineral resources, access to finance. I think the banking system, the global financial system has to be regulated better. There are manpower issues, and of course, finally, avoidance of conflict. It's a very, very complex issue, and you can't really deal with it in its globality so easily. And finally, with regard to attracting FDI, the role of private sector investment, I think is a huge issue for developing countries to attract foreign direct investment, and that comes from the private sector. So you have to have conditions in your country which make it attractive for foreign investors to come in. Number two, a private sector, if a country has a private sector which can invest, this presupposes that there's already a highly well-developed economy. And that's not the case with most countries. And finally, new breed of leaders, but how are you going to develop that breed? I don't know.
Well, you've given us a question to finish with. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your participation. Before I ask you to thank the panellists, I'd just like to make a couple of very brief concluding remarks. Thank you for your contributions today. This is not the end of a conversation, it's the continuation of a conversation. I invite you all to communicate with EastWest Institute staff, its directors, keep us informed of what you're doing and we'll keep you informed of what we're doing. We'd like your critical evaluation of the conference. There's a form in your folders, but we'd also like your critical evaluation of the ideas that you've heard today. We'd also like to hear creative proposals for collaboration with you or with people you might know to take some of these issues forward. On that note, let me thank you for your participation. Let me thank all of the wonderful EWI staff and volunteers who've done a great job. Let me thank the team of the World Customs Organization for their great job. They do a good job every year. And if you could give us, our panel, a collective clap and yourselves a collective clap. Thank you, Marcia.